I got an email from Baxter this morning. He said, if you see my wife, please blow her a kiss. That was for you. Baxter is hiking the trail in Spain in a very prayerful way and wanted to let you know that he misses you and you were in his prayers this morning. I have a friend who lives in Georgia. His name is Larry. He is a rabbi. We used to get together, I think I've told you before, on Wednesday mornings to read Hebrew together. He was prepping for his Friday Sabbath sermons. I was prepping for my Sunday morning sermons. We would often offer each other illustrations from our particular faith traditions that we might use in our respective sermons, stories from our particular faith. On one particular Wednesday morning, I shared with him a story from the life of Jesus, and that he might want to use as part of his Sabbath Friday evening sermon. And he paused for a moment and he said to me, he said, you know, if I had lived in the first century, I would have been a follower of Jesus. And I said, well, why not now? He said, no, you Christians have done too much to him over 2,000 years. But if I had lived in the first century, I would have been a follower of Jesus. Because in the first century, people didn't think about Jesus being God and attribute those sorts of things to Jesus. Jesus in the first century was truly a reformed Jew. As my friend Larry said, he was a Jew who took the law seriously, but didn't take the law literally. Jesus was a person who put people above precepts. And so Jesus would heal on the Sabbath, even though it was against the law. Jesus would touch lepers, even though it was against the law. Jesus would talk to women, even though it was against the law. Jesus would befriend Samaritans as he traveled, even though it was against the law. He was a reformed Jew. He knew that life was more about bringing people together than it was separating people. And so Larry said, yeah, if I had lived in the first century, I would have been a follower of Jesus. I'm a reformed Jew. So the text began today, and the Pharisees came to Jesus to test him, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? What a text for Communion Sunday, right? Do you realize this is the second time in as many months that I've had to preach on a text that deals with divorce? I think God's just out to get me. I think that's what it is. It's the second time in as many weeks, 2 weeks in a row, that we've had a story of Jesus welcoming children. Why in the world are these two stories together? And what does any of this have to do with world communion? Well, here's what Jesus knew that I think we need to know. The law separates people. Period. The law separates people. The Hebrew word is badal. Say that with me. Ready? Badal. One more time. Badal. It is one of the most common verbs in Old Testament law, Genesis to Deuteronomy. It means to divide or to separate. I want you to think about how many times the word divide, separate occurs from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Just think about the very first chapter of Hebrew Torah in Genesis chapter 1. God separates the heavens from the earth. God separates the water from the sky. God separates the water from the land. Badal. By the time you get into the book of Leviticus, God is separating clean food from unclean food, sick people from healthy people, one type of linen or cloth from another type of linen or cloth, separating men from women, separating Jewish people from Moabites. The word is always badal, to divide or to separate. And we all know that practically in our day, I mean, you think about it, practically in our day and time, when we have wanted to separate ourselves from someone we didn't like, didn't agree with, didn't want to be around, we always go back to Old Testament law, don't we? Interracial marriage, badal, there's a verse. Gays and lesbians, badal, there's a verse. Slaves, badal, there's a verse. People of other cultures, badal, there's a verse. People who are physically ill or mentally ill, badal, there's a verse. We always go back to the law, to this word, to find some way to separate ourselves from people we don't want to be around. It's one of the most common verbs in Old Testament law. And when it comes to the most intimate of all relationships, marriage, the Pharisees asked Jesus, listen, in order to test him. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? It's one of the most complicated issues in all the law. Was then and is now. So Jesus answers, is it lawful? Is it lawful in the Old Testament for a man to divorce his wife? Yes, it's lawful. Moses told you any man can give his wife a certificate of divorce. If your wife burns the goat stew at night in the tent, if your wife wears the wrong color cloak in the morning, if your wife talks back, if your wife is not as cute as your secretary, for any reason, are you listening to me? For any reason, a man could take his wife to the front stoop of his home and say 3 times, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and the divorce was certified. Certificate of divorce. She left without the house, she left without the sheep, she left without the savings account, she left without the kids, she is gone. That's the law, badal. So the question is it lawful? Is it lawful? Jesus just answers. If you're asking me a legal question, yes it is. The Torah also says that when 2 come together, they become one flesh. And what God joins together, no one should separate. But in an attempt to avoid badal, and in an attempt to avoid separation, the law separates us again. Well, it separates the righteous from the unrighteous. I'm using those terms sarcastically. It separates the self-righteous from the perceived unrighteous. When you think about when you break that law, how often you're separated from other people or from part of your culture. I don't know how many times I have to fill out documents at some point, almost every week or every month, that differentiates me because of my marital status. I have to check a box that says married or divorced, and some of them have nothing to do with the way I live at my house. I mean, I don't even know why they asked the question. How many years did the church separate people? You know, not too long ago in the history of the Protestant church, if you were divorced, you couldn't be a member of the church, or you were put out of the church. Later on, you could be a member, but you couldn't be a deacon. And later on, you could be a deacon, but you couldn't be a minister, because divorce was associated with adultery. Remember, if a man leaves his wife or a wife leaves her husband, it's adultery. All the while forgetting somehow in our self-righteousness that to look at a woman and lust after her is adultery. For God, idolatry is adultery, to misplace your affection in any way. If your hobby takes up more time than your spouse does, it's adultery. It's idolatry. If your job takes up more time and energy than the time and energy you give your spouse, it's idolatry. It's adultery in God's. But divorce separates us, badal. Some religious folk have even used this law, because remember the question was, Jesus, is it lawful? Some have even used this law to say that what God has joined together, no one can separate. And I have heard religious leaders write and say, encourage and sometimes force people to stay in relationships they've got no business staying in because it's the law. It separates us on the grounds of justice and ethic and compassion. So the disciples come to Jesus and they say, is it lawful? Is it lawful? And Jesus responds, if you'll allow me to paraphrase, if you're asking me if it's lawful, if you want a legal answer, according to Jewish Mosaic law, yes, marriage, divorce, it's lawful. It's full of law. Regardless of how you look at it, though, the law separates you. You don't stay together in your relationships, and you don't break your relationships because of the law, because the law will always separate you. In fact, if you don't believe the law will separate us, just look at the very next verse. Strange, isn't it? So the very next verse after this whole legal discussion on divorce says, and people were bringing their children to Jesus to touch them, and the disciples were sternly rebuking them. You know why? Because it's the law. Didn't we just talk about this last week? It wasn't lawful for a rabbi or a man to touch a child. Children are sweaty, snotty, dirty little creatures. Yeah, they are. And for a man to touch or tend a child likely would make the man ritually unclean, and so children were to be avoided and to be separated from the men and certainly from the rabbis and relegated to the care of women. Do you find it amazing that we've had to talk about this for 2 weeks in a row? That this story appears 2 chapters in a row in the Gospel of Mark? That apparently 2 days in a row in the life of Jesus, Jesus had to call children to himself and say it's okay for a rabbi and a man to touch this child and bless this child and hold this child and be in the presence of this child, because we don't get it. It is not lawful to hold a child, but that's exactly what Jesus does. Because while all of these things are lawful and full of law, the law is not where Jesus lived. And it's not where you want to live either. And when people go back to this verse in the New Testament to undergird what they think everybody else should be doing in their life, they are doing what Jesus was almost subversively trying to get them not to do. If you're asking me if it's lawful, sure it's lawful, but you and I don't want to live according to the law. We want to live according to love. We want to live according to justice and compassion. So I understand what Rabbi Larry meant when he said if he had lived in the first century, he would have been a follower of Jesus. Because I knew Larry really well, and Larry was a person who took the law seriously, but he didn't take it literally. And Larry would have never put precept over people. And Jesus and Larry and you and me, we know how complicated every life is, how complicated every story is, how complicated every journey is. And Jesus didn't let the law dictate how he felt about people. He simply loved them, whatever road they were on, and whoever they were. Nowhere is that more clear than the communion table. And I want to invite you to this table now.